Flight attendant pushes black woman out of first class and collapses as she says what could make an entire flight crew fall silent in the middle of the sky? Why did a woman with quiet eyes and a doctorate in ethics sit alone in seat 2A and say nothing, even after being humiliated in front of a full cabin? And who exactly is Dr. Naomi Ellison, the woman whose soft voice would soon turn the entire airline industry upside down? This isn't just a story about race, it's about silence, about dignity, and about what happens when someone refuses to break not with anger, but with grace. Because when injustice flies at 35,000 feet, it doesn't land quietly. What was said in the final minutes of Flight 807 will stay with you long after the plane touches down. So, before we begin, ask yourself, would you have spoken up? Would you have stood? Or would you have just watched? Now, take a deep breath. You're about to hear a true story of stillness, power, and transformation. If this kind of story moves you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let's fly into it. The quiet hush of dawn had just begun to settle over Denver International Airport when Dr. Naomi Ellison stepped out of the town car. The air was cool, thin, and tinged with jet fuel and brewing coffee, the unmistakable aroma of modern travel. Her polished loafers tapped gently on the sidewalk as she pulled a single carry-on behind her, its wheels humming in rhythm with each stride. She paused just before the sliding doors, taking in the soft pink and gold light creeping over the tarmac. For a moment, Naomi closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She didn't need this flight. Not really. She could have just reviewed reports from her home office. She could have sent a consultant, but she didn't believe in second-hand truths, not when the future of Monarch Air rested in her hands. Inside the terminal, everything pulsed with controlled urgency. Neon flight schedules blinked updates. Families wrestled with strollers. Business travelers cradled phones between their shoulders and chins, muttering about contracts and calendars. Naomi moved among them like water, fluid and composed, her pressed navy blazer gently swaying with each step. At 61, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered boardrooms, courtrooms, and classrooms alike. A professor of human rights law, Naomi had spent decades advocating for structural change. Now, she had stepped into a new arena: corporate leadership. What few knew, outside a carefully selected board, was that Naomi had recently become the majority stakeholder in Monarch Air. In less than a month, she would assume her role as chairwoman of the board. But today, she wasn't here as a leader. Today, she was here as a passenger. She approached the kiosk and scanned her boarding pass. First class, Monarch Air Flight 227, Denver to San Francisco. A direct flight, just under 2.5 hours. Plenty of time to observe. That was the point. Naomi tucked the pass back into her leather folio, zipped it closed, and joined the security line. She had chosen not to use her privileges. No executive lane, no staff escort. She wanted no one to know who she was, not yet. She needed to see what it felt like to fly without a title or a nameplate. Only then would she understand what needed changing. The line moved slowly. When it was her turn, the TSA agent gave her a polite but distracted nod, barely glancing at her license. Naomi didn't mind. She had learned long ago that dignity wasn't determined by the gaze of others. It came from within. As she gathered her things on the other side of the scanner, she noticed a small tear in the corner of her blazer sleeve. She smoothed it gently, then smiled to herself. Perfect. She didn't want to appear affluent, just professional, unremarkable. She found her gate C-27 and settled into a seat by the window. A young couple was arguing softly nearby about whether they had packed enough snacks. A boy in Spider-Man pajamas twirled around a suitcase handle. The energy was human, messy, familiar. Naomi liked airports for that reason. Everyone equalized by waiting. The gate agent announced boarding for first class and priority passengers. Naomi stood, collected her bag, and stepped into line behind a man in a gray wool coat. She noticed him glance at her and then double-check her boarding group on the screen. She said nothing, just nodded politely. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, she felt a strange flutter in her chest. Not nerves. Something else. Something like readiness. The scent hit her immediately hot metal, recirculated air, and the sharp tang of sanitizer. She entered the aircraft and smiled at the junior flight attendant who greeted her. A young man in his 20s, bright-eyed and warm. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome aboard," he said. "Thank you," she replied with a nod. She made her way to seat 2A, a window seat in the second row of first class. The leather was clean and smooth, the stitching precise. She placed her folio in the seat pocket and stowed her bag under the seat in front of her, declining the overhead bin. She liked to keep her things close. Just as she sat down, she noticed movement from the galley. A woman approached, her posture straight, chin high, uniform immaculate. Her name tag read Marla Dean, senior flight attendant. Marla was in her late 40s, with sharp cheekbones and a tight bun that glistened under the cabin lights. Her eyes scanned the cabin, landing on Naomi for a fraction of a second longer than the others. Naomi met her gaze. "Good morning," Naomi offered gently. Marla hesitated, then nodded. "Boarding pass, please." Naomi blinked. "I'm sorry," Marla smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Boarding pass, just to confirm seating. Naomi reached calmly into her folio, pulled up the digital pass on her phone, and handed it over. Marla leaned in, inspecting the screen as though searching for counterfeit ink on a digital device. After a beat too long, she nodded curtly. "Thank you." Then she turned and walked briskly away. Naomi felt the first stone drop in her chest. She looked around. Other passengers had settled in without issue. No one else had been asked to verify. No one else had received that slow question and stare. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer and looked out the window. Her mother's voice came back to her, low and firm from years ago. "Hold your head high. Naomi, the world doesn't get to decide where you belong." The memory steadied her. She took out her notebook, opened a blank page, and wrote Flight 227, 7:53 a.m., boarding pass request for seat 2A. Others not asked. She didn't write with anger, only precision. This wasn't her first time in turbulence, and it would not be the last. The engines hummed beneath her seat like a distant thunder held in suspension. Dr. Naomi Ellison leaned back into the leather of seat 2A, exhaling slowly as the aircraft pulled back from the gate. The window beside her revealed streaks of condensation forming on the glass. The early morning sun now casting a pale blue sheen across the wing. She folded her hands in her lap. Around her, the quiet shuffle of magazines, seatbelt clicks, and the polite murmurs of first-class travelers created a soft, rhythmic cocoon of order. Naomi had always liked this moment just before takeoff, the in-between, a pause before acceleration, but this time the air inside the cabin felt tighter. Marla Dean returned to the front of the cabin, standing stiffly beside the galley curtain, her hands folded over one another, polished fingernails gleaming. Naomi noticed how Marla's eyes swept the first-class cabin again, not in service, but surveillance. Then came the smile. It was the kind that stretched only from cheekbone to cheekbone, never touching the eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marla began, her voice precise and clear, "welcome aboard Monarch Air Flight 227 nonstop service to San Francisco. Flight time today is estimated at 2 hours and 18 minutes. Please direct your attention to the safety demonstration." As Marla gestured toward the exits, Naomi glanced around. Every other passenger sat passively, nodding politely. The man in 1A was already dozing behind aviator sunglasses. The couple across the aisle clinked glasses of orange juice. Naomi looked back toward the galley. Marla's eyes met hers again, just briefly. That same flicker, that same questioning. After the demonstration, Marla disappeared into the galley and returned moments later with a tray of drinks. She served the passengers in rows 1 and 2. Naomi waited her turn. When Marla reached her row, she stopped beside the man in 2B, an older gentleman with silver hair and a sports jacket embroidered with a country club logo. He smiled up at her. "Mimosa, if you don't mind," he said. "Of course. Mr. Glenn," Marla replied warmly, freshly chilled. Naomi watched the interaction, noting the ease in Marla's shoulders, the softness in her voice, familiarity, comfort. Then Marla turned. "And for you," she asked Naomi, voice returning to its crisp neutrality. "Lemon water, please," Naomi said. "No ice." Marla nodded once. She disappeared into the galley. Several minutes passed. Naomi watched her reflection in the window, blurred slightly by the frost. She tried not to read into the delay, but her heart, trained over decades to listen to the subtle, began to beat a little louder. When Marla returned, she placed a plastic cup on Naomi's tray. "Ice water," she said. Naomi blinked. "I asked for lemon water. No ice." Marla tilted her head, the faux smile returning. "Oh, we're out of lemons. Sorry." Then she turned and walked away before Naomi could reply. Naomi stared down at the cup. She glanced across the aisle. Mr. Glenn had a slice of lemon floating lazily in his mimosa. She reached for her notebook again and wrote 9:11 a.m., lemon water refused. Cabin still stocked. Ice included despite request. She closed the notebook slowly and placed it in her seat pocket. A small voice spoke from beside her. "Did she just lie to you?" Naomi turned. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, sat diagonally behind her in 3C. Her hair was tied back, face fresh and unpainted. She leaned slightly forward, eyebrows furrowed. Naomi offered a calm smile. "It's possible." Or perhaps she just didn't want to explain herself. The young woman looked embarrassed. "I shouldn't have said anything. Sorry. It just felt weird." Naomi nodded. It was. The woman sat back, chewing her lip. As the plane climbed, Naomi looked out the window again. The landscape fell away beneath them. Fields turning to quilt patches of brown and green. Above the clouds now, the world looked endless. But inside her chest, it felt smaller. She had seen this pattern before. Polished indifference, selective enforcement. It was not rage or open insult. It was more dangerous than that. It was the subtle, precise orchestration of small indignities, the kind that left no bruises but exhausted the soul. She closed her eyes. Images came unbidden. A law student, 22, being followed through a department store, a panelist at a tech conference mistaken for catering staff, a mother being asked if her daughter light-skinned was adopted. She opened her eyes again. The plane had reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt light dimmed. Marla moved down the aisle once more. This time, Naomi was ready. As Marla approached, Naomi spoke gently. "Excuse me, Miss Dean." Marla stopped, blinking. "Yes, could I please have a napkin?" Marla hesitated, then reached into her pocket and handed one over. "Certainly." Naomi looked up. "Thank you." Their eyes locked. Something in Marla's expression flickered a twitch of her jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, like she couldn't quite figure out what Naomi was doing here, like her brain was trying to reconcile a puzzle she didn't realize she had built from broken assumptions. Naomi let the silence stretch for just a breath longer than was comfortable. Then she smiled, folded the napkin carefully, and turned back to the window. The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered, several rows back. Ethan Rhodes, the younger flight attendant, watched quietly from the galley curtain. His eyes followed Marla's posture, then flicked toward Naomi. Something in his chest pulled tight. He'd seen this before, too. He just didn't know what to do about it. Not yet. Back in seat 2A, Naomi pulled out her phone and scrolled briefly through emails. One from the Monarch Air executive team. Time-stamped 4:12 a.m., sat unopened. Subject, finalized shareholder update. Ellison transfer complete. She did not open it. She didn't need to. Instead, she opened a new note and began writing her observations. There was a calmness in her keystrokes. Not cold, but focused. This was what her mother had meant all those years ago. Hold your head high, know who you are, and when the world pretends not to see you, make sure you're watching them. The clouds outside thickened into soft white blankets. The hum of the engine deepened. Naomi sat still, watching the sky change. She had boarded as a mystery, but soon the cabin would learn. She was not here to be dismissed. She was here to bear witness. The first hour of the flight moved slowly, but not uneventfully. There was no turbulence in the air, but tension curled quietly between the rows like smoke, the kind only some passengers noticed, the kind that made you question if you had just imagined it. Naomi Ellison remained still in seat 2A. Her body was relaxed, but her mind alert. She listened, not just with her ears, but with her entire being. How the flight attendant's tone shifted from one passenger to another. Who got a smile, who got a sigh, who was seen, and who was merely tolerated. She had spent her life studying systems, educational, judicial, political, but now, sitting 38,000 feet in the sky, she was watching a system just as familiar, unspoken, but tightly organized. One that turned someone like her into a quiet exception. One that made room for privilege and politely edged out presence. The contrast sharpened when Ethan Rhodes returned from the rear cabin. The junior flight attendant's face lit with a natural kindness that had no pretense. He began offering mid-flight snacks to the first-class passengers. His tray filled with warm mixed nuts, dried fruit, and biscuits still wrapped in crisp packaging. He greeted each person with the same gentle tone. Then he reached Naomi. "Good morning, ma'am. Would you care for some cashews or maybe a biscuit with jam? We just heated a fresh batch." Naomi looked up, slightly surprised. "Thank you, Ethan. I'd appreciate a biscuit and perhaps some tea if it's not too much trouble." "Not a problem at all," he said with a small smile. Give me 2 minutes and I'll bring it right over." She watched him walk back toward the galley, marveling at how simple decency could feel like a gift. It reminded her of her late husband. Paul, he too had known how to make people feel seen, not because he had to, but because he believed everyone carried a story worth respecting. She blinked away the memory just as Ethan returned. "Here you go. Chamomile. No caffeine. I figured you might want something calming." He smiled again as he placed the cup gently on her tray. Naomi met his eyes. "Thank you." "Ethan, that was thoughtful." He nodded once before turning to the next row. She made a note. 10:14 a.m. Ethan Rhodes, respectful, neutral tone, attentive, no indicators of bias. It was strange, she thought, how those small differences began to stack like bricks, not just in behavior, but in atmosphere. She could feel the shape of the air shifting depending on who was in front of her, across the aisle. Mr. Glenn was now deep into his second mimosa and flipping through a business magazine. The woman in 3C had put on headphones but kept peeking forward, occasionally glancing at Naomi with something like concern in her eyes. And then it happened. Marla Dean returned to the cabin and stopped abruptly by Naomi's seat. No announcement, no eye contact, just presence. Cold and tall like a wall you had not asked to be built. "Miss," Marla said, her voice overly formal, "I'll need to ask you to step out of this seat and return to your originally booked class. This seat is assigned to a premium member. You may have boarded incorrectly." Naomi didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply blinked once and tilted her head. "This is my assigned seat. 2A. First class. My boarding pass was verified earlier." Marla's smile had vanished. She looked briefly to the man in 2B, who now lowered his magazine and raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this is not a discussion. You may have been upgraded in error. I'm asking you to cooperate." Naomi reached for her folio, calm as ever. She opened the boarding pass again and held it up. "Flight 227, Denver to San Francisco, seat 2A. First class, issued under the name Dr. Naomi Ellison, confirmed." Marla took a breath and glanced down, pretending to examine the screen. Then she said something that made the cabin go quiet. "I find it very hard to believe." The words landed with a thud, followed by silence. Naomi said nothing for a long moment, not because she didn't have words, but because the weight of those words had echoed through her life too many times before. She was not surprised, just tired. She heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me." The young woman in 3C had taken off her headphones. "I just want to say I saw her scan her pass. She was one of the first to board. She sat here the whole time." Marla turned toward her with a flick of irritation. "This does not concern you. Miss, please remain in your seat." The tension broke when Ethan reappeared from the galley, holding a second tray of biscuits. He stopped mid-step, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Is there a problem?" Marla turned sharply. "Ethan, I'm asking this passenger to move to economy due to a possible upgrade error." Ethan looked to Naomi, then at the boarding pass still glowing on her screen. "That's not an error. I saw her check in myself. She belongs in 2A. Marla's face froze. Naomi looked down again, not at her pass, but at her hands, steady, composed, still resting in her lap like they had on countless podiums, courtrooms, classrooms. She had not changed. Only the altitude had. With a voice that carried neither anger nor apology, she said softly, "I am Dr. Naomi Ellison, and this seat was issued directly under my name by the executive office of Monarch Air. Then she leaned forward just slightly, and if you would like to escalate this matter, I recommend you do so with care. The silence in the cabin had taken on a new weight. Several heads turned. Mr. Glenn sat upright now, lips parted but silent. The young woman in 3C mouthed something under her breath. Marla stumbled backward half a step, blinking. Then she turned without another word and disappeared behind the galley curtain. Ethan gave Naomi a brief nod of respect. "If you need anything, just call me." Naomi inclined her head. "Thank you." She turned back to her tea. The aroma of chamomile rose gently toward her, calming but not sweet. A drink made for quiet strength. She sipped it slowly and opened her notebook again. The lines she wrote were clear. 10:31 a.m., attempted removal from first class, public claim of mistaken upgrade, public refusal, statement of identity confirmed, support from junior staff, observation from passengers. She closed the notebook gently. She was no longer just observing. She had become the lesson. Naomi did not expect applause. That was not the kind of woman she was. But she did notice the way the air shifted after Marla vanished behind the galley curtain. Not with noise, but with awareness. A quiet current running from row to row, carrying the weight of what had just occurred. Some passengers tried to return to their magazines or screens. Others looked down into their laps, as if embarrassed to have witnessed it. But a few eyes lingered, curious, wary, empathetic. Ethan busied himself near the beverage cart but kept glancing toward Naomi's seat. He had not intended to intervene, but something about the scene had pulled the decision out of him like a reflex. He knew the rules. He knew how chain of command worked on a plane, but he also knew what he had seen and what he had felt. Marla's reaction had not been about a seat. It had been about control, about territory, about perception. Back in 2A. Naomi finished her tea and folded the napkin into a triangle, placing it neatly beside her notebook. She noticed that the man in 2B, Glenn Brower, had turned toward her slightly. He spoke quietly. That was handled with grace. "Doctor, I apologize for not saying something sooner." Naomi looked at him, her expression soft but unwavering. "Thank you, Mr. Brower, but silence is also a choice." He blinked at that, caught slightly off guard by the truth in it. He nodded once, then turned back to his seat. She had not intended to shame him, only to name the silence for what it was. In row 3C, the young woman leaned forward again, resting her chin on the edge of her seat. "I just wanted to say I'm really sorry that happened. I'm Kayla, by the way." Naomi offered a gentle smile. "Thank you, Kayla, and thank you for speaking up. It meant more than you might think." Kayla's face warmed with quiet pride. She sat back, hands still folded around her coffee. Naomi's phone buzzed faintly on her tray table. She picked it up, saw a new message from her assistant back in San Francisco. Update from Legal Internal Audit at Monarch HQ is moving forward. CFO confirmed your name will remain confidential until the first press cycle. She locked the screen without replying. She was not here as a lawyer today. She was not here as a compliance executive or shareholder. She was here as a passenger, a black woman, a witness, a teacher. From the front of the cabin, Marla reappeared. Her posture was rigid now, her face tighter. She moved mechanically, collecting used cups and trash from the rows ahead. When she reached Naomi's row, she hesitated only a moment before speaking. "Would you like me to take anything?" Ma'am Naomi passed her the empty cup and napkin with a simple nod. "Thank you." Their fingers did not touch, their eyes barely met. As Marla turned away, Kayla watched her walk past. You could almost hear it, Kayla thought, the way power shifted when the truth was no longer quiet. Ethan, meanwhile, lingered near the jump seat behind the curtain. He checked the manifest again, then looked at the names, comparing seat assignments. He saw her name again, Dr. Naomi Ellison, executive class, confirmed twice, booked directly through Monarch Elite. He stared at it, heart thudding. There was something else happening here, something bigger than a seating dispute, something more than a disgruntled crew member. He returned to the front and quietly asked Naomi if she needed anything else. She looked at him for a moment, then spoke in a tone that was both curious and kind. "How long have you been flying?" "Ethan. Almost 4 years. I transferred to Monarch after working regional flights out of Phoenix. You learn a lot up here." Naomi nodded slowly. "I imagine you do." And today he hesitated. "Today reminded me of what matters." She smiled. "A real one, the kind that came from somewhere quiet and earned. Good. Just before the drink service resumed, a man in 4A stood and stretched. He was tall, clean-cut, maybe mid-30s, and wore a subtle gray suit. He approached Naomi's seat and spoke softly. "Excuse me. Dr. Ellison." She turned, surprised. "Yes, I'm Eric Baines. I work for Monarch's legal team. I was on the flight to prep for the San Francisco summit. I recognized you when you boarded, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to be noticed." Naomi gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Baines. I appreciate the discretion." He leaned in slightly. "I also saw what happened earlier, and I want you to know that. We're not all blind. Some of us are listening, even up here." Naomi met his gaze. There was no performance in his voice, just concern, and perhaps regret. "That's good to know," she said. He lingered a moment longer, then returned to his seat without fanfare. Naomi turned back to her window. The clouds were thinner now. Wisps stretched across the sky like threads of silk. Somewhere below them, the miles ticked toward California. She folded her hands again and felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, but resolve. The silence had been broken. For the first time in the flight, she allowed herself to remember the day she first agreed to audit Monarch's DEI practices. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she believed in transparency, in accountability, in the idea that systems, like people, could be corrected. She thought of her students at Howard, the ones who came up after her, the young interns in her firm who had never flown first class but dreamed of it, the ones who practiced their voice in front of mirrors before walking into rooms that didn't want them there. She thought of her father, a janitor who used to read law books while mopping courthouse floors. He used to say, "If you cannot open the door, make them open it for someone after you." She had done both. Near the cockpit, Ethan looked back toward her seat. He didn't know all the details, but he knew the moment had shifted the entire cabin. It was like the plane itself had absorbed the change, and deep inside, he began to wonder what part he would play in this flight's legacy, the kind of flight that would be talked about, the kind of flight that would not just land in San Francisco, but somewhere in the memory of a nation. By the time the flight crossed into Nevada airspace, the silence in the cabin had grown dense, as if everyone sensed a shift but no one wanted to name it. The incident earlier between Marla and Dr. Naomi Ellison was not a moment easily brushed off. It hung there in the recycled air, in the slight stiffness of shoulders, in the flickering glance of a phone camera too slow to catch the full weight of what happened but fast enough to capture the aftermath. Naomi herself had resumed her stillness. She had not spoken more than a handful of words in the last 20 minutes, but her silence was active. Like a held note, her fingers rested again on the leather-bound notebook on her lap. She was writing without writing, thinking in layers, turning over the fragments of power, perception, and presence that lived inside these narrow aisles and seats. Her calm unnerved Marla. From the front of the cabin, Marla kept peering through the curtain as if expecting Naomi to get up and cause a scene. But she did not. She never had. That was the discomfort, the absence of fury, the refusal to give her rage. Naomi had met condescension with composure, and it left Marla without a role to play except her own exposed one. Ethan Rhodes felt the tension too. He had been moving back and forth between first class and economy, checking trays, collecting wrappers, pretending he was focused only on tasks, but inside he was turning something over. That moment when he saw the senior flight attendant, Marla Dean, standing over a dignified black woman and declaring, "I find it very hard to believe." That sentence had cracked something open in him. It reminded him of his sister in grad school, of her being pulled aside in the library by security because she fit the description. It reminded him of the customer who once asked to speak to someone older because he couldn't possibly know what a good wine was. It reminded him of the times he had said nothing. Not today. Back in 2A, Naomi slowly opened her notebook and began to write again. 10:58 a.m. Flight continues. Marla avoiding contact. Ethan present, observant, cabin aware. Social temperature elevated. Passengers subdued. No apology received. Systemic context confirmed. She paused, then added a line in cursive. Power does not always scream. Sometimes it watches. From 3C. Kayla leaned forward again. "Dr. Ellison, can I ask you something?" Naomi turned slightly. "Of course. What do you do? I mean, outside of this?" Naomi smiled gently. "I'm an attorney, corporate law, oversight, compliance, internal accountability, and I teach." Kayla nodded, intrigued. "You're kind of amazing." Naomi let out a soft laugh. "Only kind of," Kayla grinned. "Okay, definitely amazing." Naomi looked at her, seeing not just a young woman but a younger version of so many she had mentored. Curious, brave, growing. "You spoke up earlier. That's not nothing. I didn't even think about it," Kayla admitted. "It just came out. That's how courage works. It shows up before doubt has time to build walls." They exchanged a look that needed no further words. Across the aisle, Glenn shifted uncomfortably again. He had not spoken since Naomi's quiet rebuke, but now he leaned slightly closer. "I used to work in publishing, retired now. I thought I understood things like this. I read the articles, but today I saw it." Naomi nodded once. Seeing is the first step, but naming it, that's the work. Before Glenn could respond, a soft chime rang through the cabin, a quiet alert. Naomi's eyes flicked upward. Ethan reappeared moments later. He moved carefully, watching Naomi first, then stepping toward the front. He leaned toward Marla and whispered something. Her face tightened, I'll handle it." "What is it?" Naomi asked softly, more to herself than anyone else. Within minutes. Marla returned to Naomi's row, trying her best to wear a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Ma'am, I've just spoken with the pilot. He was informed that there is a special meal request tied to your profile, and it's being brought forward from the galley. It appears the kitchen had a file mislabel, and it was stored with crew inventory instead of passenger dining." Naomi blinked slowly. "I didn't request a special meal." Marla paused, lips tightening. "Then, perhaps your office did. In any case, we'd be happy to serve it now." Kayla watched, confused. Glenn, too. Naomi gave a small nod. "Fine, thank you." As Marla walked off, Naomi turned to Kayla and whispered just loud enough, "Watch carefully now. We're about to find out who's actually running this flight." 5 minutes later. Ethan returned with a tray, but it was not a meal. It was a sealed envelope. He handed it to Naomi silently and stepped back. She opened it and read the single line inside. "Your ID was flagged. Private manifest confirmed. Protocol Raven is now active." She folded the paper. That was fast. Naomi looked out the window as the clouds broke open below them. Somewhere far beneath was the dry Nevada basin, stretching endlessly toward the California border. Somewhere down there. Boardrooms were preparing for her arrival. And now, someone on this flight was learning what it meant when silence held teeth. Marla came back to retrieve the unopened tray. Naomi said nothing, but when their eyes met, the senior flight attendant flinched. Back at the jump seat, Ethan checked his device again. A second update had arrived. Unusual for mid-flight. Internal audit ping confirmed passenger doctor Naomi Ellison, Title Executive Compliance Advisor, Division Monarch Governance Council status, silent oversight passenger, Level 1 crew protocol, enforce respectful conduct policy immediately. His chest tightened. Ethan turned to Marla, who had now gone pale. She had seen the alert. She understood now. The woman she had tried to eject, the woman she dismissed as a mistake in seat assignment, was not just a passenger. She was the storm behind the audit, the voice behind the silence. Naomi sat quietly, closing her notebook with a click. The reckoning had begun. Not through anger, not through shouting, but through the still presence of a woman who refused to vanish. A woman who knew that sometimes the most powerful protest was to remain seated exactly where you belonged. Naomi had learned to read the air the way some read spreadsheets or contracts. She knew when the pressure shifted, when people held their breath without realizing it. That is exactly what she felt now in the cabin. Tension was no longer abstract. It was physical. It was Marla walking slower, Glenn fidgeting with his cuffs, Kayla half holding her breath, glancing at her phone like something might appear there to explain what her gut already understood. Even Ethan's footsteps had changed, not hurried, not nervous, just deliberate. Naomi had felt it before, the quiet before corporate winds shifted. It was the same silence just before a whistleblower's name got whispered across departments, the moment when power began to understand it was no longer invisible. She had not expected Protocol Raven to activate midair. Usually, it stayed dormant unless things escalated. But then again, few incidents reached this level of audacity. Marla had tried to remove her from a seat she was not only entitled to but specifically assigned by Monarch's executive travel team. What had Marla said, I find it very hard to believe. That sentence had done more than offend. It had confirmed the very pattern Naomi had been sent to observe. From the galley. Ethan returned with a glass of water, his hand steady. He crouched slightly beside Naomi's seat, careful not to draw attention but clearly aware that he now stood at a quiet crossroads. "Dr. Ellison," he said under his breath. "I just received an internal notice through the crew system. I did not know who you were. I want to say that." Naomi gave a small, kind nod. Knowing who someone is should never be a condition for treating them with respect. Ethan paused, then said quietly, "You're the one from the Oversight Council, the one they say reviews the entire chain of crew behavior and policy enforcement." She met his eyes. "I am." "Are you going to report her?" Naomi's expression didn't change. "I already have." Ethan stood back up slowly. There was no malice in her voice, no vengeance, just truth and clarity. Back near the cockpit, Marla stood with her tablet in hand, staring at the screen. Her fingers were shaking. She was reviewing her own incident log, something flight leaders did after minor disruptions, usually noting food issues or passenger complaints. Today, there was a blinking notice at the bottom. Executive Oversight Passenger Active Evaluation in Progress. That explained the envelope, the tone of Ethan's voice, the odd glance from passengers who had clearly been watching. Her stomach sank. She opened her private crew messages, and there it was. From Monarch Compliance Watch, Subject Incident Alert, Flight 807, attention required, conduct-related issue involving priority oversight passenger. Immediate suspension of discretion authority recommended pending internal review. She knew what that meant. It meant she was already being watched, not from the ground, from within. Monarch had built a quiet system of ethical auditing after a scandal 5 years earlier. Naomi Ellison had been the one brought in to design it. And now the architect was on her flight, in first class, calm, dignified, dangerous. Marla stepped into the lavatory and locked the door. Her chest tightened. How had she not seen this coming? Naomi did not look like someone powerful. She looked ordinary, well-dressed, yes, elegant even, but not threatening. And that, Marla realized, was part of the trap. She had dismissed her, assumed her seat was wrong, assumed her tone was defiant, assumed that someone who looked like Naomi could not possibly be above her in the hierarchy. The worst part was not the mistake. It was that it had not felt like a mistake at the time. It had felt normal. She sat on the closed toilet lid and pressed her palms to her eyes. Ethan returned to the jump seat, where the lead stewardess should have been. He checked the cabin, then checked the internal crew feed again. Another message had appeared. From Raven Dispatch Update. Proceed with full documentation. Passenger protection protocols remain active. Empowered crew may stabilize cabin. No escalation needed unless obstructed. He looked back toward Naomi. She was writing again. Behind her, calm, something was building. He felt it. Not in her voice, she had barely raised it, but in her presence, like someone holding up a mirror and making everyone look. Kayla leaned forward again, whispering across the aisle. "Are you okay?" Naomi smiled faintly. "I am." "Are you?" Kayla nodded, then hesitated. "What happens now?" Naomi paused, then replied, "Now, we see if the system works, or if it only pretends to." She turned slightly and looked at Glenn, "And we see who finds their voice when it is no longer safe to stay quiet." Glenn looked down, then back at her. "I'd like to make a statement. when we land, if that helps." "It does," Naomi said. "It always helps." Suddenly, a voice crackled over the intercom. The captain. His tone was neutral, but Naomi could hear the shift. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been informed of a passenger support protocol in progress. Please remain seated and courteous to one another while we complete our route. Thank you for your cooperation." Most passengers did not know what that meant, but a few glanced toward Naomi, and she remained still, a quiet center in the storm, inside the lavatory. Marla felt her pulse in her throat. She heard the announcement and understood the subtext. They were not going to protect her this time. Naomi folded her notebook and placed it into her leather bag. She closed her eyes briefly, thought of her mother, of her students, of the girl she once was, seated in the back of a city bus, watching a white woman demand her seat because her own was torn. This time, she had not moved, and the world was watching. From the jump seat, Ethan radioed the cockpit quietly. "Cabin is stable, Doctor. Ellison is safe. Requesting confirmation of ground team at SFO." "Affirmative," the captain responded, and with that, Naomi exhaled, not out of relief, but readiness. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as Flight 807 began its gradual descent toward San Francisco International Airport. The seatbelt signs had not yet lit up, but everyone could feel the shift in air pressure. The way the horizon tilted ever so slightly as the plane leveled off from its cruising altitude. Passengers started gathering their things in that quiet, restless way that people do when they know a journey is ending, but still fear what's waiting on the ground. Naomi Ellison was not afraid, but she was preparing. There was a soft gravity to her now, the kind that gathers in someone who has spent a lifetime calculating when to speak and when to remain still. In her lap, her leather notebook was closed. Her hands rested calmly on armrest. Her gaze fixed out the window. Below, the coastline shimmered in ribbons of gold and silver, sun reflecting off the Pacific as if the ocean itself was listening. Marla had returned to her jump seat, but had not looked toward Naomi again. Her posture was tense. She shifted every few minutes, as if waiting for an announcement that might reverse what had already been set into motion. But none came. Ethan walked slowly through the aisle, checking seat backs, nodding silently at passengers, avoiding eye contact with Marla, but stopping just a moment longer near 2A. Naomi looked up and nodded. "Anything I should know?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Protocol Raven will continue upon landing. Discretion transfer happens once the ground team boards. Thank you," she said, and Ethan understood she meant more than those 5 words. He nodded and moved on. In 3C, Kayla was watching Naomi again, her face etched with worry. "Do you think she's going to be fired?" she whispered. "That's not my decision," Naomi replied. "But consequences tend to find their way to the people who think they are above them." Kayla looked down at her hands. "I've seen things like this before. Not this exact thing, but moments. When someone crosses a line and nobody says anything." "What did you do?" Naomi asked gently. "Nothing," Kayla admitted. "I was afraid." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She let the words settle. "Fear is real," she said finally. "But silence is expensive. The cost just doesn't always show up on your own receipt." Behind them, Glenn shifted in his seat. He was holding his phone but not scrolling. He was staring at the black screen, seeing himself reflected back. His fingers trembled slightly. He had not spoken again since asking Naomi if he could make a statement, but his thoughts had been loud, deafening even. At 72 years old, he had built a life on being polite, courteous, reasonable. But politeness had not protected anyone today. Not Naomi, not Kayla, not even him. He had witnessed something cruel, something subtle and sharp, and for those first few minutes, he had done what came naturally. He had waited. He had rationalized. He had hoped it would resolve itself. Now, as the plane descended into clearer skies, he felt something else. Shame. When he looked up, Naomi met his eyes, and, without words, she let him know it was not too late. From the front of the cabin, the captain's voice came over the speakers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be touching down shortly at San Francisco International. Local time is 11:36 a.m. Ground temperature is 63 degrees. Please ensure your tray tables are up and your seat backs are in their upright position. We will be landing shortly." There was a quiet flurry of motion. Buckles clicked. Belongings were gathered. Naomi did none of that. She stayed still, not because she wasn't ready, but because readiness, for her, had nothing to do with luggage. She had packed her truth long before boarding. Marla finally rose from her seat. She walked the aisle one last time with rigid efficiency. Her eyes darted toward Naomi and quickly away. There would be no apology, no explanation, not now. She was in survival mode. Ethan, however, remained composed. When he returned to his station, he discreetly tapped the control panel near the galley and entered a 4-digit code. A green light appeared. It was the silent confirmation. The ground liaison team had arrived. Naomi took a slow breath and exhaled. From her window, she saw the airport skyline coming into view: air traffic towers, long, sleek hangars, the shimmering glass terminal. Her reflection in the glass was calm, collected. But inside, her thoughts moved fast. Would they try to deflect blame? Would the incident be minimized as a misunderstanding? Would Marla attempt to shift the narrative? She knew the patterns. She had written the framework used to track these exact interactions. She also knew that none of those deflections would hold, because this time, people had seen it, documented it, felt it. This time, silence had ended at 30,000 feet. The plane touched down smoothly. The wheels hit the runway with a soft thump, and the brakes hummed low as the jet slowed to taxi speed. Passengers shifted in their seats, already unbuckling. A few looked toward Naomi, not with pity or even curiosity, but with something closer to recognition. They knew they had witnessed something that was not about rudeness or simple error. They had seen a line crossed, and a woman who refused to step back. As the aircraft rolled toward Gate 17, Ethan spoke briefly into his earpiece. Ground team confirmed. Liaison standing by. Passenger remains in 2A. Copy that. Naomi reached down and slowly zipped her leather bag. It was a simple motion, but to Kayla, it felt symbolic. The moment had ended. The story had not. When the plane came to a full stop, the usual scramble began. Overhead, bins clicked open, bags were tugged down. People leaned into aisles with quiet urgency, but no one moved from Naomi's row. Glenn stayed seated. Kayla waited too. Ethan approached and leaned down. "Dr. Ellison, the liaison is boarding now. Please remain seated. You'll be met by Monarch personnel." "Thank you," Naomi said. The door opened with a hiss of compressed air. A man in a charcoal gray suit entered. He wore a small lapel pin and emblem known only to Monarch insiders. His gaze scanned the cabin quickly. When he saw Naomi, He gave a single respectful nod. "Dr. Ellison, I'm Aaron Monroe, Director of Passenger Conduct Oversight. We're here to escort you safely to the terminal and initiate the formal review. Would you like assistance with your bag?" "No, thank you," she replied, standing with quiet strength. "I'm ready." Aaron nodded once more and stepped aside. As Naomi moved forward, the aisle parted not out of fear, but reverence. She passed Kayla, who touched her arm softly. "You changed something today," Kayla said. Naomi smiled. "So did you." She walked past Glenn, who looked up with watery eyes. "I'm going to write the statement," he said. "I believe you," Naomi replied. She passed Marla last. There was no exchange, no words. But in Marla's face, Naomi saw something she had seen many times before. The beginning of consequence. And then she was gone. Into the light of Gate 17, into the next room, the next report, the next reckoning. The terminal at San Francisco International Airport buzzed with its usual rhythm of footsteps, rolling suitcases and half-heard announcements, but the corridor that led to the Monarch Passenger Ethics Office was unusually quiet. Naomi walked with deliberate calm beside Aaron Monroe. Behind them, Ethan followed at a respectful distance. No reporters, no cameras, just soft lights, glass walls, and the echo of shoes on tile. Aaron didn't speak much. He had been trained not to. His job wasn't to offer comfort or apologies. His job was to record, verify, and initiate the process. But even he could not help noticing the way Naomi carried herself. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't bitter. She moved like someone who had seen this all before and chosen, this time, to stop it from continuing. They reached a secure room labeled Interview Suite B. Aaron keyed in a passcode, opened the door, and gestured inside. "This way, Dr. Ellison." She stepped in. The room was simple frosted glass, a round table, 2 chairs, a small monitor. It looked like a meeting room, but the lock on the inside told a different story. Aaron joined her after a pause. Ethan remained outside. "Would you like a moment before we begin?" Aaron asked, pulling out a chair. Naomi shook her head and sat down. Her bag rested beside her, the strap tucked neatly away. "All right then," Aaron said, adjusting his tablet. "This is a formal intake under Monarch Ethics Protocol 12.3. You're designated as a Class A oversight passenger, and your statements carry executive weight." "Are you ready to proceed?" "I am," Naomi replied. "Please state your full name and role." "Dr. Naomi Ellison, Senior Advisor to the Monarch Executive Oversight Council. My clearance level is Sapphire." Aaron raised an eyebrow slightly. That was higher than he expected. Not even all executives carried Sapphire status. He continued, "Thank you. Please describe, in your own words, the incident as you experienced it." Naomi took a breath and let the silence settle before she spoke. At approximately 9:12 a.m. Pacific Time, while boarding Flight 807 in Denver, I was approached by the lead flight attendant, Ms. Marla Dean, who questioned the legitimacy of my first-class seat. She did not greet me. She did not inquire respectfully. She assumed, based solely on my appearance and perhaps other prejudices, that I did not belong in Set 2A. Aaron was already typing. She continued. Her tone was dismissive. When I calmly explained that I was indeed assigned that seat and presented my boarding pass, she refused to accept it as valid. She accused me of lying. She physically reached across me in a manner that was both inappropriate and aggressive. attempting to signal another passenger that the seat was unoccupied. Did she ever apologize? No. She never used the words "I'm sorry," or made any attempt to correct her behavior until it became clear who I was. And when did she become aware of your identity shortly after the flight was airborne? I believe it was during beverage service, when Ethan returned to ask if I needed anything and recognized my protocol envelope. Aaron paused. We've already received preliminary reports from passengers who witnessed the exchange. One of them, Glenn Brower, submitted a signed statement just before you landed. His description matches yours. Good, Naomi said. Aaron studied her face. There was no anger there, no vindictiveness, but there was resolve, a quiet certainty that no longer needed defending. He tapped through a few more fields, then looked up. Do you believe this was racially motivated? Naomi didn't hesitate. Yes, I do. Why? Because a white man in the same seat would have been offered a drink. Not suspicion. Because Ms. Dean did not question the boarding pass of the white passenger in 1A, despite the fact that he boarded behind me. Because this is not the first time this has happened to someone like me. Only the first time it happened to someone with the power to change the outcome. Aaron sat with that. We do not ask that question lightly, he said, but we need it answered, not for you, for the data, for the system. I understand, Naomi replied. I helped write that question. He smiled faintly. Right, of course you did. He adjusted his seat. There will be a full review. Ms. Dean will be suspended pending investigation. A response letter will be issued to you within 72 hours. You have the option of requesting a public hearing, though that usually follows only if systemic failure is proven. It was systemic, Naomi said, not because of her alone, but because no one stopped her. Until they knew who I was? Aaron nodded. His tone shifted. You know, I've worked at Monarch for 12 years. I've sat in this room with dozens of passengers, victims, complainants, a few scammers too, but you didn't raise your voice, you didn't escalate, and yet, we're all sitting here like something exploded. Naomi looked him in the eye. Because something did. She leaned forward slightly. We cannot keep asking victims to perform outrage for us to take them seriously. Calm is not consent. Silence is not comfort. Dignity is not permission. Aaron sat back, absorbing it. That line, calm is not consent, he repeated quietly. You can write it in your report, she said. He smiled again, this time with something warmer behind it. I will. Naomi stood, sensing the interview was over. She extended a hand. Thank you. Mr. Monroe. Aaron took it. No, thank you. Dr. Ellison, we needed you on that plane more than we knew, outside the room. Ethan was waiting, looking slightly anxious. When Naomi emerged, he stood straighter. All set, he asked. She nodded. And Marla. She's been removed from active rotation. Her badge has been pulled. Naomi let out a soft breath. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you call her out publicly? Right there in front of everyone, Naomi's eyes softened. Because I've spent my life knowing that the moment I raise my voice, they stop hearing my words. Power does not always need volume. It needs patience, precision, and witnesses. Ethan looked down, then nodded. Thank you, Dr. Ellison. I'll never forget today. She placed a hand gently on his arm. Neither will I. She walked toward the terminal exit, the world outside gleaming with the gold of a late morning sun. In her bag, the notebook remained sealed, her story written, now ready to echo, and with every step she felt lighter, not because justice had been served yet, but because truth had finally taken flight. Naomi Ellison did not linger near Gate 49B. She walked past the newsstands and vending machines, past the sterile gray benches, and past a billboard for Monarch Airways that read, "Where respect takes flight." The irony was too thick to pause. Outside, the fog over San Francisco was beginning to lift. Inside the terminal, however, a different kind of haze still lingered. Passengers who had been on Flight 807 were dispersing slowly, like people leaving a courtroom. Some glanced at Naomi as she walked. A few nodded, fewer smiled. Most remained silent, unsure of what they had just witnessed, but aware that it mattered. She headed for a quiet corner of the terminal, a place where windows stretched high above the tarmac and the rows of chairs were mostly empty. It was a space designed for waiting, but today she needed it to think. She sat by the window and took out her notebook. The last few pages were blank. Not for long. As her pen touched the paper, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, Dr. Ellison." Naomi turned. A young woman in her 20s stood there, backpack slung over one shoulder, a Monarch lanyard around her neck. Her badge read, "Maya Lynn, Intern." "I hope I'm not interrupting," Maya said, her voice uncertain. "You're not," Naomi replied gently. "Would you like to sit?" Maya nodded quickly and took the seat beside her, a bit too stiffly, like a student unsure of how close to sit beside the professor. Naomi waited. "I was assigned to ground support for Flight 807, Maya said. "I saw the internal alert come in while I was reviewing gate schedules. I recognized your name. I studied your framework last semester in ethics class. You're the reason I applied to Monarch in the first place." Naomi offered a small smile. "And how has it been?" Maya hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Honestly, confusing. People here talk about values a lot. Diversity, inclusion, customer care. But it feels like a script sometimes. And today, seeing what happened, it shook me." Naomi closed her notebook slowly. What part of it, Maya stared out the window for a moment. That she felt so safe doing what she did, that no one stopped her, and that if you hadn't had that envelope, if you hadn't been who you are, we would have all just kept moving, like it was normal. Naomi nodded. "That's what disturbed me too." Maya shifted. "Why do you think it happens like that? Because the script is easier than the truth," Naomi said. "We teach compliance, not courage. Policies are printed, but behavior that's modeled, and too many people have learned that politeness can be a mask for prejudice." Maya let the words settle. Then she asked something she had been afraid to. "Can I do anything?" Naomi looked at her. Really looked. "Yes. You can ask better questions than the people before you. You can speak up before someone is humiliated, not after. And you can remember that your silence can be as loud as your voice." Maya blinked hard, trying to hold something in. "I won't forget this," she said softly. "You're not supposed to." Naomi replied. They sat for a moment longer before Maya stood. "Thank you. Truly." Naomi nodded, and the young woman walked off with a bit more weight in her steps. Not heaviness, responsibility. As the terminal thinned out, Naomi's phone buzzed. A message from the Executive Oversight Council. Subject: Reflight 807 incident, Naomi. Statement received. Full support confirmed. Advisory committee will fast-track your recommendations. We expect media inquiries. Would you like to respond or designate a spokesperson?" She stared at the screen for a moment. She knew what the council was expecting. A polished press statement, carefully framed language, strategic tone, but that didn't sit right with her anymore. She tapped the mic icon and recorded an audio reply. "Use my voice, no spokesperson, no edits. Let people hear me exactly as I am. This isn't a scandal, it's a lesson. And lessons only stick when they sound like the truth." She paused, then added one more line. "Make sure the crew hears it too." She hit send and leaned back. Across the terminal, a small crowd was beginning to form near a nearby gate. It wasn't about her. A delayed flight, someone crying softly, a woman trying to calm a child, real life, continuing on, unbothered by policy or protocol. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. This had never been about her seat, or even her dignity. It had been about the system, about the way it failed quietly, habitually, and about the moments when it could still be reclaimed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Dr. Ellison." She turned. Glenn Brower stood there, suitcase in hand, face lined with worry and something else regret. "I saw you from over there. I wasn't sure if I should say anything," he said. "You already did," Naomi replied gently. "Your statement helped." He nodded, relieved but still uneasy. "I should have said something sooner. Back on the plane, I froze. And then, when I realized what was happening, I felt ashamed." Naomi's voice was soft. "It's not shameful to be slow. It's only shameful not to change." Glenn exhaled. "My daughter's in college, studying law. She called me after the flight and asked me what I did when it happened. I didn't have a good answer. I want a better answer next time." "Then you've already started," Naomi said. He gave a small smile. "Thank you for not turning this into a spectacle. Truth doesn't need noise to be heard," Naomi said, "just presence and memory." Glenn nodded once more before heading off. She watched him disappear into the crowd. Then she stood, packed her notebook, and walked toward the exit. Her car was waiting. Her work was waiting. The next flight, the next meeting, the next moment where someone would need to decide whether to speak or remain silent. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a mirror. And today, for once, people had looked. The Monarch Airways corporate headquarters sat just outside downtown San Francisco, wrapped in steel and glass, its atrium designed to impress visitors and its marble floors polished to a quiet gleam. But today, the building had the anxious hum of a place trying to look composed while bracing for a storm. On the 17th floor, inside the Office of Corporate Integrity, Harold Whitman stared at a looping security feed of Flight 807's boarding process. His jaw was tight, his eyes bloodshot. As Chief Risk Officer, he was used to scandal. He had handled pilot strikes, data breaches, and a mid-air engine scare that cost the company $8 million in rebookings. But this felt different. This was not a machine malfunction. This was a moral one. He paused the video on a still frame of Marla Dean standing over Naomi Ellison, arms crossed, face hard. There was no sound, but the body language spoke volumes. He tapped a few keys, bringing up the timestamp and syncing it with passenger reports. So many people had seen it. So few had done anything. A knock came at the door. "Come in," he said without turning around. Juliana Hale entered, head of public communications. Her heels clicked softly across the carpet as she approached. "You saw the footage," she said, settling into a chair. "I did," Harold replied. She waited, but he didn't continue. "We're getting press inquiries every half hour," she said. "The council approved Naomi's statement for public release. It'll go live within the hour. Raw audio, no edits, her voice, her words." He finally turned toward her. "And the crew suspended pending review. Marla Dean's union rep is demanding a private hearing. Claims she was under stress, and the passengers' half a dozen statements filed, all supporting Naomi's account. One woman from Seat 5D sent in a video. It's shaky, but you can see enough." Harold closed his eyes for a moment. "This is going to outlast the news cycle, isn't it?" "Yes," Juliana said, "because it's not just about her. It's about us. About all the little ways we've let things slide, the silence, the selective enforcement, the training that looks good on paper but stops short of real transformation." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were documents Naomi had helped craft years ago, recommendations, oversight protocols, a diversity audit strategy that had been shelved for being too disruptive to operations. He laid it on the desk. "We ignored her then." Juliana nodded. "And now she is the storm." She leaned forward. "Harold, we can spin stories, we can deflect, we can fire Marla, retrain staff, release statements, but if we don't actually change something foundational, this will all just come back louder." He looked at her, measuring her words. "You want to bring her in, don't you?" She didn't flinch. "Yes, as an advisor, an independent oversight architect, let her rebuild the thing we never had the courage to build." Harold exhaled. Then, after a beat, he nodded. "Do it. Schedule the meeting." The following day, Naomi walked back through Monarch headquarters, a place she hadn't stepped into in 3 years. The receptionist at the front desk stood taller when she saw her. Elevator doors opened as if guided by something other than mechanics. People turned to watch, unsure whether to greet her or simply move aside. She took the stairs up to the 17th floor. Juliana was waiting in the glass meeting room. A carafe of water. No cameras, no suits, just the two of them. "You look good," Juliana said warmly. "I feel tired," Naomi replied honestly. "That means you're honest. That still looks good on you." Naomi sat down and placed her notebook gently on the table. "I assume you're not just calling to apologize." "No, we're calling to ask." She slid a single page toward her. An offer, advisor-level clearance, authority to oversee the retraining curriculum, direct line to the board. Naomi scanned it, then looked up. "And what about accountability structural change? Policy reformation? Transparent reporting?" "All of it," Juliana said, "if you'll lead it." Naomi stared at the page, her fingers resting lightly at its edges. "Do you know what the hardest part of that flight was?" Juliana waited. It wasn't Marla. It wasn't the silence. It was realizing that nothing about what happened surprised me. It didn't shock me. It didn't even offend me. It just confirmed what I had known, what I had warned about. Juliana's voice was quiet. "That's the part that breaks me too." They sat in silence for a while, a silence that was heavier than words. Naomi finally folded the paper and slid it into her notebook. "I'll do it," she said, "but on one condition. Name it. Every crew member will undergo immersive bias training. Not slideshows, not lectures. real story-centered empathy modules, and it starts with the executive team. Juliana smiled. Deal. Naomi rose and shook her hand. Then we start now. As she left the room, something shifted. Not in the air, but in the building itself. It was subtle, a tightening, a breath held, a door not quite closed behind her. And for the first time in a very long time, Monarch didn't feel like a place afraid of the truth. It felt like a place trying to earn it. The training room on the 12th floor had once been designed to inspire. Wide glass windows overlooking the city skyline, ergonomic chairs, smart boards that responded to touch. Aesthetically, it was flawless. But to Naomi Ellison, the space felt hollow, like it had all the tools but none of the truth. She stood quietly at the front of the room, no podium, no title slide, just a folding chair and a pitcher of water beside her. Around her, more than 20 crew members, supervisors, and even 2 executives were seated in silence. Some arms crossed, some jaws tight, a few visibly uneasy. None of them expected what was coming. There were no introductions. Naomi began not with a fact, but a question. When was the last time you made someone feel small? The room didn't move. She let the silence thicken, letting it breathe discomfort. I don't mean intentionally. I mean by tone, by omission, by a shrug, a policy you enforced more strictly on one person than another. Still, no one spoke, but a few eyes lowered. What you felt on Flight 807 was turbulence in the cabin. What I felt was turbulence in the soul. She paused. And what matters more is that most of you didn't feel anything at all. A younger flight attendant in the second row. Elijah shifted. He looked maybe 23, not long out of orientation. He raised his hand. "Can I say something?" Naomi nodded. "I didn't work that flight, but I watched the footage, and I read the transcript from the investigation, and I just keep wondering why no one stood up, like not even just to de-escalate, just stand up, because standing up alone takes something we rarely train for." Naomi replied, "Emotional courage. It doesn't come from a checklist. It comes from knowing who you are when no one else is looking." A few heads nodded. Slowly, Naomi stepped forward. "I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to hold up a mirror. You are going to spend the next 2 hours writing, reflecting, and listening. Not about policy, about memory." She handed out blank cards. On the front, write about the first time you felt invisible. On the back, write about a time you made someone else feel that way. There was some awkward shuffling, a few sighs, but soon the room filled with the soft scratch of pen on card. Naomi walked slowly between the rows. She didn't read over shoulders. She just let them feel her presence. She was not here to accuse. She was here to unlock. After 15 minutes, she spoke again. Would anyone like to share? There was a long pause. Then a middle-aged man in the back stood up. His name tag read Dennis K. "I was raised by a mother who cleaned motel rooms her whole life," he said, voice low. "She used to come home with burns on her arms from bleach, but she smiled through it. When I got this job, I thought I had escaped all that. But last year, I asked a woman to move from the priority boarding line because her shoes looked too worn down. She wasn't in uniform. She had a perfectly valid ticket. I assumed, and I watched her walk to the back without saying a word." He sat down. Silence again. Then Elijah raised his hand. I'll share mine. My dad worked airport security. He got mocked for his accent all the time, but he never pushed back. He just smiled, said it wasn't worth it. Last month, I overheard a gate agent mocking a passenger's name and I laughed along. I didn't even think twice, until now. Naomi listened. No judgment, just presence. Thank you both, she said. You've done more in these minutes than most corporations do in years. The door opened and Juliana stepped in. Not to speak, just to observe. Naomi turned to the board. Bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper in policy, a pause in service, a tightened smile. She drew 3 words on the board. Acknowledge, repair, rebuild. Those are your new wings. If you can't wear them, you don't fly. The room was silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer defensiveness. It was awakening. She handed out new cards. Write what you're going to do differently the next time you're in uniform. No slogans, no safe words. Write what will cost you something to change. People began writing, this time faster. Juliana stepped forward, her voice quiet. We're going to make this training permanent, required, recurrent. You'll lead the team that builds it, Naomi. Name who you need, we'll follow. Naomi nodded, then she looked around the room again. The last part of this session is simple. Tomorrow, you'll each write an anonymous letter to someone you ignored, hurt, or silenced. You won't send it, you'll just carry it, and when the moment comes again, and it will, you'll remember the weight of it in your pocket. She turned off the lights. That's it. You're dismissed. But no one moved right away, because sometimes silence is the first sound of accountability. 3 weeks later, Flight 511 began its final descent into Washington. D.C. The skies were calm, bathed in a soft amber glow from the late autumn sun. It was the kind of landing that promised no drama, no turbulence, just arrival. In Seat 2A, Dr. Naomi Ellison sat in a quiet reflection. Her window shade was half open, catching the fading light across her cheek. She had declined any special treatment, refused upgrades, insisted on being booked like any other passenger. The name on her ticket was her birth name, Naomi J. Ellison. No title, no alert flag in the system, no escort at check-in, just a woman traveling home. This flight was never about the destination. It was about the atmosphere. She studied the cabin with gentle curiosity. A young mother was soothing her toddler with whispered lullabies. An elderly white couple across the aisle smiled politely at every flight attendant who passed by. 2 businesswomen behind her traded spreadsheets and ginger ale over muted conversation. And then there was the crew. Every interaction felt deliberate, not performative, genuine. A new rhythm was in the air. More eye contact, more pause between questions and assumptions, less autopilot, more presence. Naomi could feel it. And not just because she helped redesign the training, but because this time the change felt earned. She closed her eyes and let herself breathe. Midway through the flight, a flight attendant came down the aisle offering tea and coffee. She was new, maybe mid-20s, hair in a neat bun and her posture upright but not rigid. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Would you care for something warm?" Naomi looked up. She recognized her immediately. Marla Dean, but her name badge now read something else. It said Marla D. No last name, just an initial, but her eyes gave her away. Marla hesitated for a second, her voice steady but her fingers tightening on the pot. Naomi offered a soft smile. Chamomile. If you have it, we do, Marla replied quietly. Fresh batch. I'll be right back. She walked away with purpose, not shame. It was a small moment, nothing cinematic, but it told a bigger story than any apology ever could. When Marla returned, she placed the porcelain cup gently on Naomi's tray. I know who you are, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Naomi nodded. I know who I am too, Marla added, and I'm trying. Naomi looked her in the eye, not with judgment, with something deeper. That's all I ever asked. She took a sip. It was warm, fragrant, and more than just tea, it was a kind of peace. Hours later, Naomi stepped off the plane into the terminal at Reagan National. She was not met by news crews or flash photography. No ceremony, no press releases, just a quiet arrival. The same way most people move through life seen only by those who bother to really look. She walked toward the ground transportation exit and paused briefly to check her messages. A text from Juliana read, First round of stories from the new training just came in. Real ones. You changed the atmosphere? Naomi replied with only 2 words. We did. Outside, a soft rain had begun to fall, not heavy, just a steady, cleansing drizzle. A black sedan pulled up. The driver stepped out and greeted her with respect, but no fanfare. Dr. Ellison. Just Naomi, she said gently. He nodded and held the door. As they pulled away from the curb, Naomi leaned her head against the window. The city rolled past in slow rhythm, people walking briskly beneath umbrellas, buses hissing along wet pavement, a child holding their father's hand, hopping between puddles. She watched it all with eyes that had seen far more than injustice, eyes that had seen transformation, not in headlines, but in heartlines. 2 months later, a letter arrived at Monarch Airways headquarters. It came in a hand-addressed envelope with no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, creased neatly down the center. Dear Dr. Ellison, I was on your flight, not the one that went viral, the one that changed quietly. Flight 511. You didn't know I was watching, but I was. I saw how you spoke to the crew, how you carried yourself, how you said thank you with your eyes before your lips. I'm not proud of who I was before your training. I used to justify my silence by calling it professionalism. I used to enforce policy like it was divine law. I wore my uniform like a badge of correctness. But that day, I wore it like a promise. Because of you. I did not grow up learning how to see people who looked like you as leaders, or architects, or calm revolutionaries. But now I do. Now I see it in myself, too. I am learning. Please know, your presence that day mattered. We are flying differently now. Signed, a crew member who is becoming more human. Every day, Naomi read it once, then again, then folded it back into the envelope. She placed it inside a small wooden box on her desk labeled Unseen Winds. Inside that box were cards, scribbled notes, and folded napkins with words of change. None of them public, all of them priceless. She closed the box and looked out her office window. Far above the runways, another plane took flight. It was Monarch 807. Same flight number, new crew, different story, and this time the cabin air felt clean, not just because the filters worked, but because the people inside had finally learned to breathe together. In a world where prejudice often travels unnoticed, sometimes the most powerful protest is quiet, measured, unshakable. Dr. Naomi Ellison never raised her voice. She never demanded revenge. And yet, through her stillness, she held up a mirror to an entire system. She reminded us that change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it lands in silence and echoes forever. This story wasn't just about a flight. It was about seeing what we've been trained to ignore, about holding people accountable not to punish them, but to awaken them. To those who've ever been pushed to the back, to those who've been told they were too loud, too angry, too different. Know this: your presence is not a disruption, it is a revolution in itself. If this story moved you, let it move someone else too. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that expose, uplift, and heal. Because the sky may belong to everyone, but only when we learn to fly with justice. See you in the next story.